Good morning. Good morning to all. We are now starting the second day of this international conference. And today, this group will discuss politics and social policies under the state crisis. We'll have as speakers, first, Eduardo Gomes from the Federal University of Fluminense Federal University, Andrew Fischer, Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus, University of Rotterdam, Netherlands, and Renata Bichir from USP, and with comments of Rubén Leopoldi from Argentina, CIEP. Okay, so we'll start with Eduardo Gomes, and each talk will have about 20 minutes. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Maria Antonieta, Anastasia, Renata, who hasn't arrived yet. And my paper may look old, but it's new. And anyway, the new dimension or concern I added to a previous research which focused on councils of development throughout the world, but basically on BRICS minus China. And now I from yesterday in from yesterday in my studies of state capacities, I realized that this Council of South Africa, National NEDLAC, National Economic Development and Labor Council, NEDLAC. And why? That's the first slide. Well, you may know, you may not know, but there is a wave of councils building, economic and social councils building throughout the world. And they are all in this association, ICESIS, which is Association of Socio-Economic Councils. And this is related to the European Union, which is settled in Brussels. And it was founded in 1999 with 72, now with 72 members from Africa, America, Latin America, Asia, and Europe. And it's a very important association. So made of a variety of organizations, more or less structured, with different process of formations, implications, and related, all of them, to public policies of development. So this is the step, this is what may make this a new approach to NEDLAC, which I have presented before and wrote about it. So I put NEDLAC within this general wave of councils throughout the world as and embodied in this association named ICESIS. So NEDLAC stands for, as I told you, National Economic Development and Labor Council of South Africa, and with a very rigid structure and 21 years of existence. It was founded in 1995, and just as Mandela came to power. And I thought that it could be approached differently from before as a state capacity, because it's a very structured council, rigid, and also differently from other councils, has policy power to different in certain areas, especially labor policies. So it's an example to that extent, differently from what I did before. It's an example of social capacity, state capacity in the dimension, in the field of state-society relations, trying to enhance them. There are other examples like this, and other examples differently from this in the ICESs. Brazil's council is in the ICESs, and there are also regional or councils there. It's a very important association, which hasn't been taken into account in the studies of state-society, organized state-society relations. So I thought that NEDLAC, for the reasons you'll be seeing before, can be a test. Põe para mim, tá. Isso. So I thought I put NEDLAC as a test of if it fits state capacity and how it fits an idea of state capacity from all the discussion we have had here today, this week, and before. So in summary, NEDLAC is unequivocal, in my opinion, to looking first of a state capacity with very ambitious goals, a complex structure, a rigid guidelines, looking for not only organic relations between state and society, but also contribution towards redistribution and development, but also social capacity, social capital. Yes, it comes out as a okay. So it's one of the first law and has this status as a statutory body of Mandela's government, which institutionalized a dialogue between capital, labor, and government. So address these requirements of cooperatism, but also it has a fourth branch, which is called civil society. And it was created, anyway, that's the basic idea of NEDLAC, but I will go further on to see what NEDLAC is. So it comes as the long transition, it was how to say pactuada? An agreed, a pact transition. Anyway, the transition towards, again, from apartheid, after Mandela was released, was a very, very complex, and the NEDLAC ended up being a result of the formation of two commissions linked to questions of work and development, National Manpower Commission and National Economic Forum. It was a very, very, actually this process, very, very unpredictable and violent, even to the last days of the apartheid, and even after Mandela had been released. So it was founded in 1994 and became NEDLAC a permanent part of the bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy, in 1995. That's when begins Mandela's term. with a specific goal to make what we call PECs. Projects for the legislative or to the executive by demand from one or the other, or by themselves, created by themselves, not surprisingly, given the name of NEDLAC, as subordinated to the Labor Department of Labor. And it was chosen, as I mentioned to you, in the stance transition, it was chosen from the Hungary and the Irish models of corporatism too, and used a little bit of ILO ingredients, social dialogue, but also included this local ingredient, which was the fourth member, the civil society. So it was very ambitious, that I already said. So it was looked as NEDLAC in the, it was seen as an appropriate forum for discussing the working relations in the new economic movement. It was the transition from apartheid was not only from to erase the regulations against the blacks in South Africa, but also to empower labor, because they were the workers, the blacks were the workers which did not have rights. So the apartheid, there was a transition from those 2 points of view. We can go to the second one. Yes. So that's the organization, the typical organization. It's in English of NEDLAC. It has 4 chambers: Trade and Industry, Labor Market Chamber, Public Finance and Monetary Chamber, and Development Chamber. And it has the actors. Back. Yeah. So the 4 actors are in blue, from top down: business, labor, government, and community. And they are formed by different organizations. So the traditional neo-corporatism would not have community. And it was a very difficult branch or group to deal with, even as to choose who would be the leader representative. And to the right, you have we have the organization of NEDLAC. The various chambers, the 4 chambers: development, trade and industry, public finance, and
labor market.
And no.
Public
Yes,
finance,
policy and labor market. So a secretariat in the bottom, which helps everyone, the chambers, management committee, an executive council, and national summit, a meeting having held every year. So what NEDLAC has done in those 20 years approximately, so 1995, 2005, 2016, so 21 years. By and large, in the beginning, labor regulations were the major topic in the very beginning of the NEDLAC actions. So, and by and large, it was successful in dealing with new laws for labor. This Labor Relations Act, it was created a labor court and the Council for Conciliation and Mediation, which was very important, mediation and arbitration, to deal with disputes between labor and capital. This was important at the very, very same moment, or a couple of years after this, there was a massacre in South Africa. So in a mine named Marikana, it's kind of well known, and there is a movie, a documentary on Marikana with K. So that's what I mean by a violent transition. We were already in the democratization period, already with the democracy, but even then, the people, the workers were repressed very harshly. There was also various factions within the major actors present at NEDLAC. The major were the COSATU, which is was the major labor union, and the government, and the other ones. But shortly after, in 1996, the executive launched this growth, employment, and redistribution plan without consulting, by and large, without any consultation to NEDLAC. That's my question. I mean, that addressed to my question. It's a very important, formally organized, so on and so forth. So it was an effort of building a state capacity, but once in a while it was surpassed by different political interests. And the same, it was a coming and go process throughout the years. So later on, the second, which is the name of the airport of Johannesburg, Maccabi, it has another name, but one is this. So new. Then there is there was this project, the GEAR, the previous one, and then in the second president, there was this Basic Conditions of Employment Act. So this was favorable to the workers, and this part of bureaucratic elites of South Africa, many of them, most of them, related to the Congress, the African National Congress, was also related, used ILO resources to empower themselves. So one of the empowerment was this decent work, the adoption of this decent work by them. So, and that's how the trajectory of NEDLAC went on. up to 21 years of this foundation. It's now under Zuma's. Zuma is the president now involved in corruption charges, and he went further against the NEDLAC. Against it's in the second. I put there NEDLAC leaving the scene because Zuma launched a new project, named New Growth Path, and built a National Planning Commission in a very selected commission within private experts directly subordinated to him. So, and they get to a plan, national development plan, valid until 2030. So there was this. This is also an effort. NEDLAC was losing power. So throughout the years, it lost power not only by policy but as an organization. And I have been there twice, and in the second time, everyone was skeptical about NEDLAC, and everyone. And they say that it didn't work, it didn't represent, the representatives would not get to the meetings, they would send advisors, assessores. Okay, advisors who didn't, there was no continuity on the discussions, and NEDLAC ended up more or less as a lost, in a way, a fragile state capacity. And it's a controversial, anyway, a controversial ending, as it had, in a way, perhaps I didn't explore very well here, all the conditions to become an important state capacity. As time went on, and economic conditions were not very favorable, and the executive tried all those general plans, even long-term plans, and I forgot to say that NEDLAC, the output of NEDLAC would go to, especially the NEDLAC, the output on labor issues would be taken by the parliament without, the parliament was forbidden to make any change in the legislation produced by NEDLAC. So there was a hope that NEDLAC could help the empowerment of black workers, but that not even that was was not very successful. So the last, and this is shown, NEDLAC has been assessed, changed, and by scholars. One is Edwards, Sebastian Edwards. He made also using ILO funds. They made very careful reports of the success or not of NEDLAC, and the title of the last one is very. It's there. Is this repositioning peak level social dialogue in South Africa, NEDLAC into the future. One of the very clear-cut issue, proposal that Edwards make is take out NEDLAC of the labor secretary department and connect it to the cabinet, which should be the case. So there was a very this skepticism, and with relation to NEDLAC, not as I perhaps brought out before in this audience. By audience, I mean INCT. But I think there is a very important issue there about the failure of corporatism here in South Africa. Very few people know about this, but it's part, and very few people know also about ICESs. And that's it for today.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Now,
I'm in a process of selection, graduate students, so I have to leave. Okay.
Thank you for inviting me and bringing me here. It's been very fascinating so far, so I'm really happy to be part of this gathering. And when I was, well, I'm also presenting on another topic this afternoon, but when somebody do me the favor, if I start talking too fast, just wave your hand frantically, because I have the I have the habit of getting excited and then talking too fast. But yeah, so when Anastasia presented me with the task of talking about social policy and state crisis, I decided to address it through some work I'm doing that's more conceptual rather than empirical. In the afternoon, I'll be talking more about empirical stuff on other topics. But what I'm particularly concerned about here is how to conceptualize universalism for a more universal application beyond basically European welfare states. And in particular, what I see is this blurring and confusion of the concept of universalism that's taken place in the Millennium Development Goals, for instance, and now Sustainable Development Goals, or also in this whole idea that there's a revolution from the South, referring largely to cash transfers. And of course, we can question whether it's revolutionary or whether it's even from the South. But obviously, in that case, the ideal model, the case that is perhaps the best, most reflective of this is the Bolsa Família in Brazil, which Renata will talk about. So, and I'm just a bystander who observes it from the side. So I'll leave most of the commentary to you. But outside of that case, and even in the Mexican case where it's more domestically driven rather than driven by donors, outside of those two cases, the agenda has been heavily pushed by donors in a wide variety of other countries in the last, say, 5 to 10 years. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, we see this wide-scale adoption of cash transfer programs. And my research project that it's been going on for about 1.5 years now, or this one there, called AID-SOC Pro, sorry, the external financing of social policy in developing countries, is particularly concerned about that. It's looking at the role of international donors, in particular IFIs, international financial institutions like the World Bank, the IDB here in Latin America, and others, in pushing this agenda and its political economy dynamics that ensue from that, particularly with respect to how it influences and transforms social policy systems. And that's where then I would tie it back into the concerns about state crisis, because it's essentially concerned, I mean, if we think of social policy, and actually listening to everyone yesterday, I thought, in other crowds, maybe some of what I would say would be new, but I think for all of you, a lot of this will be fairly straightforward and obvious. But it's obviously the centrality of social policy in modern governance and statecraft and so on. And social policy, of course, in this sense, understood as systems of social provisioning, largely focused on education, health, broadly speaking, and social protection, which is social security and social assistance and labor regulations and so on. And the reason essential is not just simply, that's what I just made the point there. Obviously, I put C.F. Esping-Andersen here because I'm a bit critical of Esping-Andersen because he's sort of oriented the whole discussion of welfare states towards social assistance, essentially, and social security, and largely ignoring health and education. And I'll get back to that a bit later. Well, I mean, just to, I'm Canadian, so I always have a bit of a gripe with Esping Anderson because he characterizes Canada as a liberal democratic regime similar to the US and the UK, but that only makes sense if you look at the social assistance programs in Canada. If you look at health or education, it's definitely a very universalistic type of situation. Country, and you could argue the same for the UK as well. The UK, well, although that's eroding in the UK, perhaps. But it's just to say that having this wider understanding of social policy, and we obviously know that social policy is very important in its redistributive roles on the fiscal side, also in its distributive roles in terms of how it influences the valuing of labor, for instance, which I've written about as well, and also its role in its productive roles, which I think UNREST, the UN Research Institute on Social Development under Thandika Mkandaweri's leadership, has really been made a lot of headway in exploring the transformative potential of social policy, for instance. But what I would emphasize more, and I think Esping Anderson rightly does emphasize this as well, is that particularly when it comes to issues of state capacity, state crisis, and so on, social policy is so crucial, and this is from a more critical perspective in terms of its role in the sort of ordering, in the regulation and ordering of social differentiation, of social relations, and so on, which makes it so critical in terms of the types of dynamics that the various social policy choices and the mixes of choices has in terms of these various social dynamics, which is, I think, that's really the critical point in terms of looking at its role in the generation of state crisis, of which all of you are providing so much fascinating empirical detail to flesh out my ideas. But and also, of course, it's critical. I mean, I think we were discussing a lot about this yesterday, about how it's central then to issues of state legitimacy and so on. Now, getting to the point of how I think there's a confusion about universalism, I can illustrate this. For instance, I wrote a paper, background paper for the UN. What did they call it again? The thing that was to get people talking about inequality in 2012, and I was just in that paper. I was just pointing out that, you know, at that time, this is even before Thomas Piketty wrote his book, and then there was this whole surge of interest. But even before that, there was in 2012 this big surge of attention on inequality, and The Economist wrote a major issue, had a sort of one issue focusing on inequality and so on. So there appeared to be, even at that time, this emerging consensus that inequality was a problem. It was part of the push to put inequality on the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, again, this was happening very much prior to Piketty's book coming on the scene. And I've made this point also with the MDGs before this, which is that the problem with this idea of, it's a false kind of consensus, because you have the consensus that inequality is the problem, but that basically it doesn't resolve the issue of what causes inequality, but also the policies to address inequality. So actually, by depoliticizing this sense of debate that still exists, you actually can then push certain agendas forward, which are actually quite controversial. Examples of this is like The Economist, for instance, where they argued, yes, inequality is perhaps a problem, we've come to accept that, but then why is inequality a problem, what causes it, and how to resolve it? It was just basically reinforcing the same message they've been saying for 30 years in terms of the neoliberal message, that the problem is largely due to obstructions of the market allocation of labor and the market determination of wages, and how that's basically blocking the equalizing influences of the market, and that's essentially what needs to be addressed. So, for instance, they argued that the most unfair transfer of all is misdirected welfare spending, and what they refer to as misdirected welfare spending is, of course, what they refer to as misdirected welfare spending is, of course, welfare spending that is not spent on the poor, but is spent on the middle class, and hence, why are we doing that when it should be directed? So it's basically implicitly referring to targeting and attacking one of the principal notions in universalism, which is the fact that by providing goods across social classes, you create the bonds of social solidarity that reinforce sort of support for universalistic policies. If you break that, you get this political economy dynamic whereby you undermine the supply of quality goods to poor people because you remove the middle classes from those goods, right? So this is the key political economy issue within social policy that is central, sort of the catch-22 of universalism, and where there's this trick where, I mean, I think there's, to a certain degree, I didn't say that at the beginning, but this whole idea of the revolution from the South, within that, what we see is in this new left wave, or what do you call it, the pink tide in Latin America, where you had these optimal conditions, a commodity boom, more generous financial, fiscal conditions, and so on. You had the optimum conditions for these governments to push towards much more universalistic types of social policies. And instead, they generally adopted, even if, well, I mean, perhaps Brazil is a different question. I'm not sure how to evaluate that, but, well, I have some ideas, but in other countries of Latin, and perhaps Uruguay as well is an exception. But generally speaking, in other parts of Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, the model adopted has been very much the donor-conformant model of very targeted forms of residualist social protection. And now, of course, we've come to the end of this period, and if anything, that trend will worsen, right? So in a sense, we've missed this golden opportunity to really push forward much more radical, universalistic, redistributive types of policies. And a lot of my research is concerned with, you know, backward-looking why that happened. So The Economist also says no Wall Street financier, this is in 2012, right, has done as much damage to American social mobility as the teachers' union has. I mean, and this is them writing an article on inequality, right? So, or another, I mean, I had more quotes, but I just had to cut them down here because I would have spent the whole time talking about The Economist. But the biggest target for reform is the welfare states in the rich world. So this is, you know, they're setting up their agenda on, yes, inequality is a problem, but how do we deal with it? The Economist is more nuanced and perhaps a bit more veiled in how they express these things, but they nonetheless, in their World Development Report of 2013, where they also address some of these issues, their policy position continues to be emphasizing fundamentals, we know what those are, and then also non-market distorting labor policies, which basically means getting rid of labor regulations, and social protection for the most vulnerable, so targeting. Again, not emphasizing universalism, but targeting. And whenever you push the World Bank on, why don't you actually put universalism as one of your options, you know, their response is always, well, it's, you know, far too difficult to implement in, say, highly unequal societies as you have in Latin America. So let's just be realistic now and give more intermediate solutions. But the point is why not even put it on the agenda as a goal to move towards? And then I guess the question of my research then is that, or this conceptual exploration, is to say, okay, if we do put as a goal, what do we actually mean by universalism? Because how do we actually identify if we're making a movement towards universalism or away from universalism? And part of this is, again, slippage in the meaning of universalism that's taken place in a lot of these debates, partly because universalism, even by UN organizations, for instance, is being treated as just merely referring to full enrollment, for instance. So full enrollment in a healthcare insurance program covering, you know, the large majority of the population is treated as universalism, even if within that not all healthcare costs are covered by the insurance program, for instance. Or all kids going to schools, even if those schools are very segregated in the types of quality of education and the way the school systems are being managed, which I believe is a problem in Brazil. I've been seeing a few PhD theses working on that, where looking at the Bolsa Familia is similar to Mexico, being implemented through sort of somewhat segregated education systems, where you're basically reinforcing this provisioning of education, quite poor quality education, through what's ostensibly a universal social assistance program. Also, the other confusion is targeting, and this is part of the twist I think that the neoliberals have been very successful in doing, is selling targeting to the left as something progressive. Because it logically makes sense. You know, why are you giving money to the middle classes? Why not concentrate all your resources and directing it to the poor people? And I think I think probably all of us know these debates quite well. If you Tandika Makandawiri's work, of course, really is excellent in highlighting that. And also, there's also the discussion of, well, what's wrong with targeting? Because you have Skocpol's famous contribution on targeting within universalism, and what I believe there is, what I believe as she's arguing for is basically, it was the critique of universalism by feminists or people emphasizing racial discrimination and so on, making the point that if you apply equal treatment to all people in a sort of racist or discriminatory type of system, you're just emphasizing inequalities and discrimination within that system. Hence, you have to have targeted interventions that address special needs within the system. I think there's a key difference, of course, between targeting within universalism versus the modality of targeting replacing universalism, in the sense that in sense that you're targeting special needs within a universalistic education system is much more effective than trying to target special needs in a very fragmented education system, right? So it's the distinction between what we mean by targeting in that sense, right? And I think also the whole welfare state literature has really actually not been very helpful in a certain sense, and I blame Esping Anderson partly for that. But no, I know, but I don't think he cares about what I think. But in terms of, but his initial book I think had some really valuable political economy discussion, and then it sort of diverted off whole exercise of doing typologies, which, as I said, as a Canadian, I have some problems with. But then it led to a whole industry for the next 20 years of people pumping out different typologies, 13, 14, 20, 25, trying to include Latin America, Asia, and so on. And Ben Fine, actually, from SOAS, has written a wonderful article in a very Ben Fine-ish style, criticizing this literature. And it's a very good read that I think he decisively because so much of the typology is dependent on which sector you choose, what time period you choose, how you how you classify these things, and so on. So at one point, it becomes a bit of a silly exercise in a sense. And what is much more important to understand is other things, which won't belabor that point. But also, I made this point I think already. It's the confusion in applying welfare state. I mean, when you locate the understanding of universalism within European welfare states, and then you try and transpose that onto developing countries, you obviously have big problems. And I think this issue also came up in the 1990s with the literature on social exclusion, in the sense that the whole discourse of social exclusion, some people argued, I mean, I would see it more emerging out of Latin America originally, and then Europeans adopting it. But anyways, the discourse is that it came out of Europe in reference to the breakdown of universal welfare states in the 70s. And so you're talking about margins of the population gradually being excluded from the system. And how do you then apply that to, say, Latin America, where you have highly informalized labor markets, where the majority of the population is not included into the formal system? So what's the point then of talking about exclusion when it addresses most of the population? I mean, Ghana, for instance, about 80% of the labor force is informal. I'll jump on here. It's also, I mean, I had this discussion once with Hook-Jo Kwan, who worked also in UNRWA and is based in Korea, where I was at one point talking about land reform in Korea as serving the functions of universalistic types of social policy. And he said, well, at one point if we start to put everything under social policy, you have to be careful. And I think it was a valid critique, but it's the point that the roles that redistribution has played in development have been important. So if we look at South Korea purely through the angle of social assistance, it appears to have had very minimalist, if not any, sort of welfare. Then it therefore reinforces the argument that you have to develop first and develop then the social protection system after you've become wealthy. Whereas actually, if we look at South Korea through the lens of education and health, right from the get-go in the early 50s, they pushed towards quite wide-scale, comprehensive, universal basic education, and also a strong push into tertiary education. And also with healthcare, I think some modest payments, but nonetheless a universal coverage of healthcare, major achievements in improving health outcomes as a result. And then land reform is having an extremely important redistributive function in the economy that gives it the basis then to apply different types of economic strategies, which are critical to understand as components of its success, beyond just the developmental state and industrial policy and so on. I already made that point. So a few other points just on the universalism targeting dichotomy, because Makandaburi talks about this a lot. I myself have played with a lot, but actually the more I deal with it, the more I also come to question how useful the dichotomy is, because, for instance, when we look at social assistance, it's not clear actually what universalism is, right? At least in historical practice, we understand what targeting is, but what exactly is universalism? So a lot of people now would argue that basic income grants is an example of universalism within social protection, but so far we haven't actually seen it being applied any large-scale, basis beyond pilot projects, and it's also a bit controversial, which I'll explain in a moment. For various reasons. I suppose pensions could be the social protection area where you have universalism being applied. On the other hand, in health and education are the social policy sectors where the principles of universalism are most clearly identified, but then it's not clear what targeting is how to identify targeting within education and health systems. Usually in education and health, targeting isn't the relevant concept. The relevant concept is segregation, stratification, and segmentation of the system, or fragmentation, unification, and so on, rather than targeting per se. Because usually in most countries, even that have very residualist social policy systems, they still have health and education systems that are, how shall we say, health and education provisioning to poor people. So one could look at those places and say, we have universalism because we have schools for poor people, so what's the problem? But the issue then becomes more how it's segmented and so on. So basically, what was that point? I'm running out of time, I believe, so I should probably just rush. But and I think obviously the key point with the whole debate about targeting is not targeting in itself, because obviously you need to target needs, as I said earlier, but it's about the poor centricity of targeting. It's the focus on the poor, and then the differentiation and segregation of the provisioning of the poor from the rest of society in that sense, and the way that targeting systems reinforce the institutional processes that create that and reproduce that segregation, in a sense. So basically, through the process of doing this, I've tried to identify 3 key principles that, if we work with the idea of universalism as sort of more of a guiding principle, how do we actually break it down to identify what components help us identify on a spectrum, so not just ideal types, but on a spectrum going from more universalistic to less universalistic, dropping the concept of targeting in that sense. And I've identified 3. One is provisioning modalities of access and coverage, which is integration versus segregation, which I've already been talking about to a certain degree. I have a paper on this, so if you're interested more about it, I can send it to you. Colleagues in Oxford, Diego Sanchez-Sancachoa, and his colleague in Costa Rica, Juliana Martinez, have referred to this as unification and fragmentation. They just came out with a book, of which Uruguay is one of their case studies. It's an excellent book, I think. Their work's really good. And it's, again, not a private versus public issue, because you can have private provisioning within a unified education or health system, for instance, like in Canada. The question is how the system is integrated and regulated together. For instance, in social protection or social security, it's the key thing is the degree to which the social assistance and the social security system is, this is Diego and Juliana's point, is the degree to which it's institutionally integrated within the same ministry. And so it's being treated more or less according to the same types of policy rationales, institutional rationales, rather than being segmented into two different departments. And where you, for instance, in the Ecuadorian model, you have the social security system being organized very differently from the social assistance system, and there's a sort of a bit of a wall between those two. And of course the class dynamics, which I've already referred to. The second dimension is what I call the costing and pricing dimension. And this is, strong forms of universalism are basically decommodified systems, and then weak universalism is commodified systems. And in this sense also, I make the point here, note the difference with Esping-Andersen. Esping-Andersen, again, the way he treats commodification, he claims that he's using a Polanyian notion of commodification, but I believe he's confused it because he defines commodification as the degree to which labor can seek autonomy from the labor market. And I'm not sure that that was ever the intention of social protection systems, to allow workers to have long-term, say, unemployment insurance or something. I think the intention of social protection systems was more to smooth the labor market allocation and the periods of unemployment and so on. An unintended consequence of strong universalistic systems in Europe has been perhaps workers being able to be on long-term unemployment, but I don't think that was initially the intention of the system going in. So I'm not sure that the intention of a universalistic social policy system would be to decommodify labor. And if anything, a lot of universal social policy that's integrated within social democratic capitalist regimes, the purpose of social protection is more to help smooth and mediate the market allocation of labor rather than to decommodify labor. So if we understand commodification in Polanyian terms, it's treating something for buying and selling on the market. So in the case of labor, it's fictitious commodity because it was not produced for buying and selling on the market, but then it's bought and sold on the market. And so in that sense, so universal systems in Europe or in Canada or in Australasia, as they say, I don't think were ever intended to substitute the market allocation of labor and to decommodify labor in that sense. It was just to assist the process of market allocation and so on, to support it. So I think that's the wrong notion of commodification to be working with. What I mean here is a much more specific notion of commodification, which doesn't apply so well to social protection, but applies very strongly in health and education. And it's the degree to which the services provided are priced according to market mechanisms, rather than the pricing being taken out of market mechanisms. They're still priced, but they're priced through internalized administrative processes. So typically strong universalistic healthcare systems, the pricing of healthcare is internalized and basically in a bureaucratic manner. It's still costed. But whereas in very weak or non-universalistic systems, like I'm thinking of my experience in India, where every year you have another top private sector hospital that comes in to provide services, and they can basically charge whatever they want as long as they can find the buyer who's willing to pay for it. And that's like a purely commodified system of provisioning healthcare, for instance, where the pricing, and you always have the base of the public provided healthcare in that case, but because you provide so many exit options, it tends to, the political economy dynamic tends to result in poor quality services, which are only last resort type of services, and people buy out as soon as they can and when they can, or if they can. The third dimension is financing, and here you have a spectrum, basically direct versus indirect. Again, universalistic systems involve financing. The indirect is basically you do not pay at the time of need, versus direct, you pay at the time of need. So out-of-pocket expenditures in healthcare, user fees and so on would be more direct forms of payment, which are less universalistic, and indirect forms of purely indirect forms of payment at the time of need. There's no exchange of monetary transaction at all. So that would be the financing dimension. And so within each one of these dimensions, I think you could locate countries across the world that don't necessarily fit into an ideal type of universalism, but that could be where their position along this spectrum in the three dimensions could be identified. And I think it's a much more useful way then to think, okay, if a country is located here, how does it move towards a more universalistic type of policy within that dimension or in interaction with the other dimensions? And the interaction, of course, is important too, because, for instance, most health insurance systems, which are working on the idea of trying to move the financing of health payments towards more indirect social insurance, along the principle of insurance, towards more indirect forms of financing, usually fall apart on the dimension of commoditization, where pricing is not controlled in healthcare systems. You have a very difficult time to have sustainable health insurance systems, for instance, on the financing side. So the interaction of these two becomes very important. I mean, in India, for instance, was discussing with the SEWA. I don't know if you know SEWA. It's the Self-Employed Women's Association. They're running one of their flagship pilot projects is this health insurance system they run for women, but of course it only provides a small coverage if you would have a catastrophic health episode. It only provides for a small amount of the expenditure that you would then need for, say, several days of hospitalization. When I questioned them on that, so they said, well, because they actually run the health insurance through a private health insurance, they contract, so they pool and then contract with a private company. And they basically said, well, it's very difficult in a very commoditized, they didn't use these words, but in a very commoditized type of system to have a sustainable health insurance program, and basically even for the private companies, health insurance tends to be a loss maker. They make their money on life insurance, they make their money on other forms of insurance, and then they offer health insurance, but they don't have a lot of interest in it because they tend to lose on it rather than they make profits on it. And it's precisely because prices are out of control. It's the same problem with U.S. healthcare. Any attempt to reform U.S. healthcare gets blocked on the whole pricing commodification issue. So I believe I've probably almost run out of time. I'm just here comparing a few other approaches to do a similar type of thing, because I think as I've been thinking about this, a few other people have simultaneously been doing it. Martinez Franzoni and Sanchez Sancachoa, too, I think is really good. They've actually critiqued me in one paper I found from theirs where they said that I was adopting a more means-oriented definition, whereas they were adopting a goals-oriented definition. I think it's splitting hairs, but I think they make some good points. This is just to demonstrate, this is old data. It's already it's from 2000, so already 16 years out of date. But it's just, I use it because I think they were not talking about this necessarily, but I think what underlies their analysis actually demonstrates a lot of these principles, that you can line up a lot of these countries, and what you have here basically is you have out-of-pocket. They were doing a whole study using household surveys trying to identify out-of-pocket expenditures in healthcare and the poverty impact that was happening. So what they were measuring is the out-of-pocket financing as a percent of total health expenditure. So how much out of the total amount that gets spent on health is coming from people paying directly at the time of need to the hospital, right? Which in Asia it tends to be quite high, especially then. I think it's been improving. And then this is the percent of out-of-pocket expenditures that are more than non-food expenditure in the household income. So it's basically measuring your essential consumption of food, and then outside of that you have the extras for housing, schooling, health, and so on, and how much of that is taken up by these out-of-pocket expenditures for what they call catastrophic health episodes. And so what you see when you compare these countries is you see a wide variety of different outcomes, where you have Vietnam being the most extreme of having almost all of the financing, India as well, coming out of out-of-pocket expenditures, and that accounting for a very high proportion of non-food expenditures for households. Where you have other countries like, say, Indonesia or Sri Lanka, where you still have a substantial share of out-of-pocket expenditure, but with a much smaller impact. Now, you could say that that's partly because they're wealthier countries, and hence households are wealthier, have more non-food expenditures. But actually, even if you control for that, you find a huge variation across countries. And what I would argue, they didn't specify it in this way, but what I would argue is that you can explain a lot of these variations according to these three dimensions that I pointed out, the modalities, but especially the costing, pricing, and financing, the different ways that states intervene to control the pricing, even if there's a large share of out-of-pocket expenditures, can have a huge impact on how those out-of-pocket expenditures then impact poverty. Like, I think a good example of that is Thailand, for instance. Much poorer than Taiwan, but achieving very similar types of results. Or here, in another view, you actually have the poverty impact. So this is the percentage of the population at that time, the year 2000, that was between $1 and $2. So this then includes a consideration of countries at similar levels of wealth measured by household income. For instance, Bangladesh and Indonesia having a similar proportion of the population between 1 and 2. This is, of course, World Bank PPP dollars, which I'm highly critical of, but nonetheless, for the sake of the discussion, or India and Bangladesh having massively different outcomes than Indonesia, for instance, in terms of the absolute poverty impact. Last two slides, if I may. Within this discussion, obviously, my three dimensions are addressing, and this is just something I've been thinking about more recently in discussions with Diego, and is obviously the analysis of the three dimensions is a sectoral discussion within each sector, health, education, social protection. Where does a country's policies line up on these three dimensions? But I think equally important in the discussions of universalism is also the systemic interaction of sectors, basically across sectors, where the interaction, as we've been discussing, I think maybe Renata will discuss in terms of both familia between social protection and education, or social protection and healthcare systems, or also non-social policies like subsidies, for instance. And here what's critical is the degree to which social policies have an additive effect or a substitutive effect. And I think where Brazil, as far as I understand, where the Bolsa has been successful, that's, I suspect, ending now, but, well, I mean, the success, where it's been successful is that the Bolsa Familia was expanded in complementary to a lot of other initiatives in the labor market and in other social policies and pensions and so on, and where actually the Bolsa Familia itself just made a minor contribution compared to, say, the effective minimum wages, and I know there's a lot of debates about that, but that's the good example of an additive effect, and that's what I suspect will probably be ending in Brazil now. Whereas in other Latin American countries, you tend to see the adoption of social protection, cash transfers, in a more substitutive manner, where it's replacing other policies. So you can say, and the problem with most micro studies of cash transfers, for instance, is then they go down, and they say, well, is the cash transfer having a positive or negative impact on household income or labor allocation or health outcomes and so on? Please finish. But the problem is that this is then, it's like a partial equilibrium. It's not looking at then what is being removed from the general equation in the process of having that small marginal effect on the household. And I think it's a fault of most studies of the impact of cash transfers, for instance. A complementary counteracting that's, I think, pretty straightforward. This is and this is what I referred to in the beginning, and this is a big issue with the basic income grants, is, and recall that one of the big advocates of basic income grants was Hayek, precisely because it was this idea that the market provisioning of social goods, like health and education, breaks down when you have poverty. So if you provide a basic income to everyone, they can use that basic income to enter the marketplace to buy your social services and so on, like health and education. So it was actually an ideal creating a functional market economy. And so we have to be careful in terms of the way the policies are conceived within the broader strategy of or menu of policies. And just to finish, I mean, this is what we've been looking at in my research project, or this is kind of the underlying motivation in our research project, and just a few teasers on what we're finding as well, is as I said in the beginning, you have the IFIs pushing a very residualist model of cash transfers on a wide variety of countries, where they're very focused on targeting, and a lot of the funding coming from, say, the World Bank and the IDB and so on is very much focused on efficiency concerns, not on expanding coverage, and on making the targeting system more and more precise to target the extreme poor. I think you're probably all aware of that because it's your daily sort of topics of discussion and so on. And what we've seen is that in many cases, the conditionality, this is being driven by conditionalities, but the conditionalities are often very difficult to identify because they're usually, the initial conditionality is stipulated in standby loans or liquidity loans, or in the case of Africa, a lot of the initial conditionalities were part of the HIPC debt relief agreements, whereby countries basically agreed to these principles, and then subsequently, I don't know exactly what to refer to this yet, maybe like follow the leader type of strategy, other donors then join in with perhaps specific project financing and so on, but without any conditionalities attached, because the conditionality was already implicit in the first place through the initial agreement that they're following along with. And the push from the donors has also been implicitly or explicitly substitutive, in the sense that it's especially, you see this very strongly in Africa, but you also see it in Ecuador and Paraguay and other countries you've been looking at, and Southeast Asia. And you see this going on right now as well, where the adoption of social protection policies is being made shall we say, conditional on the elimination of typically subsidies. I mean, this has been going on since the 80s, that the World Bank and other international financial institutions have been attacking fuel subsidies, price subsidies, food subsidies, and so on, which African governments have, even if they've consistently said, yeah, we'll get rid of them, they keep holding on to them and they keep using them. I think precisely because they have been so central to their own conception of development strategy, of looking at the government. It's sort of their way of having a government intervention into product markets and so on. It's been watered down a lot since the original use of subsidies in the 60s and 70s, but it continues to be this battle line. But the point is that if we see subsidies, food subsidies, fuel subsidies, as having this social protection function, even if they're not specifically social protection policies, and then you're bringing in a cash transfer to substitute say food subsidies or fuel subsidies, the net effect could be actually zero, right? In terms, you're transferring, the money might be going from one group of people to another, which creates a lot of political economy frictions and so on. But in terms of redistributive effect, you haven't actually increased the scope of redistribution in that economy at all. If anything, you might have restricted it. So this is in contrast perhaps to the Brazilian experience. And this also sets up a tension in the macroeconomic absorption of aid. This is a more complicated issue that I can't explain perhaps in 3 seconds. But basically, the macroeconomic absorption of aid requires the government to increase its spending and also to increase its trade deficit, non-aid trade deficit. But if you're, on one hand, the World Bank or the IMF will be telling countries to absorb aid. On the other hand, they'll be saying absorb aid by adopting a substitutive cash transfer policy that's substituting with other policies, and by implication will not be increasing government spending. It's like contradictory advice coming from the same organization, which is what we're basically seeing happening. And then the countries are then blamed for being somewhat distraught at how to manage these conflicting demands from the donors. Anyways, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good morning. I would like to start thanking. I would like to thank you, Anastasia, very much for this invitation, and I promise you to make a quick presentation because everybody's tired, and I really would like to discuss, because it's really nice to talk after Andrew, because I think we have a lot to discuss. And also because I'm pregnant, I need to go to the bathroom, so I have to be quick. Okay, this presentation is based on the work I've been carrying out since my PhD, and part of the project I carried out here at INCT-PPED, and I'm also gonna, if I have time, I'm going to present some new agenda and new ideas I've been trying to work on. Okay, so I'm going to talk about social assistance and social welfare in Brazil, challenges and perspectives, what we have done so far and what are some of the perspectives considering our political context now, which is not very good, as everybody here is aware. I will skip this because I don't have time. My main point here is that we should move beyond Bolsa Família. Bolsa Família is really, really important to understand what has happened in Brazil, especially in terms of social protection, decreasing poverty and inequality levels, but we have done much more than this, and this is quite important, especially for a foreign audience, but also in the Brazilian debate. You know, among political science, everybody is always focusing on Bolsa Família, but Bolsa Família, it's not by itself. We cannot understand Bolsa Família without understanding SUAS, the Unified National Assistance System, okay, which is broader and much more complex, and how these initiatives are being integrated with other social policies. This is the main issue. I'm totally interested in intersectoral social policies. This was a really important agenda, and now things have changed, and we have to think about what's going to happen. But this is the main point. You know, we cannot understand the recent trends in non-contributory social protection if we don't have a larger perspective, you know. And this is quite important. Social assistance initiatives in Brazil are quite old, but are really recent when we think about social policies. You know, parameters, regulation, continuity, you know, and how we build a national system. This idea is quite important in Brazil, how we can think about the health national system, the social assistance health national systems, and what kind of federative relations are implied in this kind of national systems. I think this is a main issue for me. Okay, and this is quite tricky for a foreign audience, but here in Brazil, conditional cash transfer programs were born outside the social assistance policy community. You know, it was much more economic discussion, and now we have a much larger level of integration between what we call social assistance and conditional cash transfer programs. You know, and there are differences once we look at the federal level, the level that is in charge of regulation and building the national parameters, and once we look at the municipal level. So I think it's quite important to differentiate the macro policy decisions and regulations that are carried out at the federal level and the implementation level, especially when we want to talk about state capacities, because we have different capacities enrolled at the federal level and at the local level. Okay, so I'm totally interested in this federal perspective. And for sure, I would like to talk a little bit about what has changed during this new government, during Temer's administration, but I'm not sure I will have time to do this. Okay, this is my analytical frame. I'm not dealing with the social welfare typology, but for sure we can build on this, because I have just reread all the Spin-Anderson material, and I think we have a lot to discuss. But I'm trying to deal with this literature on federalism and social policies, and the specificities of the Brazilian federalism, you know. So I'm working with this literature, the literature on implementation and multi-level governance. I think this is quite important, going beyond top-down, bottom-up, how we can think about these multiple flows of decisions. So I'm carrying out specific case studies on this. This differentiation between policy decision-making and policy-making, and what kind of actors and what kind of capacities do we need when we are talking about decision-making and policy-making, and how does it work in the Bolsa Família and social assistance relations. The idea of public responsibility. We are not only talking about state provision. I totally agree with Andrew. We should talk more about regulation, who is regulating whom, and funding. This is quite important. Celia Lessa, unfortunately, she's not here, but she has she's here? Celia Lessa? Yeah. No. Ah, okay, she's ill. Ah, okay. Oh, terrible. Yeah, it's a pity. Yeah, I really am a great fan of her work, and she stressed exactly this. We should think about public responsibility considering provision, regulation, and funding. You know, sometimes we only think about public provision, but I think we should really look at these three dimensions. I'm going to talk a little bit about state capacities, how I'm dealing with this concept. I totally agree with Celina Souza, who is not here, because if we don't specify what we are talking about, we are just, you know, expanding cacophony. You know, I'm not sure if it makes sense in English. And governance pattern, I don't have time to go deeply on this. This is related with my new work on São Paulo governance pattern of social assistance, but we can discuss later if you want. Okay, state capacities. Okay, I'm dealing with this broad definition, the overall capacity of a state to realize transformative goals across multiple spheres, scope, and also the idea of infrastructural power. The idea of capillarity is quite important in my case, you know, how the states reach the poorest, and not only the poorest, the most vulnerable people. We are dealing here with two different concepts, you know. We are not only talking about poverty. When we are talking about conditional cash transfers, the main concept is poverty. Poverty and extreme poverty. When we are talking about social assistance in Brazil, the main concept that is disputed in this epistemic community is vulnerability. It's larger and broader than poverty. This is a really, really important point, okay? Another point, we should look at capacities, bureaucratic capacities, not only for planning and formulation, but also for implementations. We are really delivering what we have designed. We are really reaching the poorest and the most vulnerable, and with what kind of consequence, okay? For sure, we have variation across policy areas, as Celina stressed yesterday. And this is quite important for me, you know. The types of state capacities that we need varies a lot considering different agendas, different goals. You know, when we are talking about redistribution, the challenge is much higher, you know, as Peter Evans has stressed, etc. Okay, how we can move further? The main dimensions I'm trying to look at: administrative dimensions, political dimensions, as Alexandre Gomes talked yesterday, and he's not here today. Okay, I thought he would be, but anyway, we are dialoguing on this. And also relational dimensions, considering how state and non-state actors interact among each other, and governance patterns in social policies depend a lot on this, how we can look at state and non-state actors providing and regulating the social policies. Okay. Going down, because I think this is important, we have a broad concept, and then we have some more specific dimensions. I think I'm going to talk about this in a more detailed way later, otherwise I will run out of time. But okay, I'm trying to look at decision-making arenas, human and finance resource, norms and rules, who is regulating who and how, mechanisms for inducing local implementation. This is quite important in the Brazilian debate. Instruments of public policies in a more French perspective. Here I'm working with Patrick Legalet concept of instruments of public policy, so I'm not talking a more technocratic perspective. It's much more a matter of thinking about the ideas and projects and how ideas and projects are being transformed into actions, and you know, we can talk about this. Modes of implementation and service delivery. This is quite important to think beyond Bolsa Família, how Bolsa Família is using the social assistance public units. We cannot understand how Bolsa Família has reached this coverage without understanding how these social assistance units have been widespread all over the country, and also this idea of territorial capillarity. In the Brazilian case, this is quite important. We have quite a huge and complex country, you know, and we are talking about a national program that has to reach Amazonia, região metropolitana de Salvador, metropolitan areas. So it's really, really complex. It seems simple, but it's not. And also, and I'm glad Paulo Janus is here, how we can think about evaluating and monitoring strategies, in order to see what we are delivering and who is getting what. Okay, this is just to stress some points and to dialogue with Andrew. Poverty and inequality in Brazil has decreased, and Bolsa Família and social assistance are only part of this story. We cannot understand this decrease in poverty levels without looking at the labor market, increasing the minimum wage, social pensions, rural social pensions, inflation, and a lot of macroeconomic dimensions, as you stressed. So Bolsa Família is part of the story. It's not the whole story. But it's really important, and it has to do with targeting and how Bolsa Família is being integrated with other policies. Poverty has decreased. Now our social indicators are going in a worse scenario, but okay, I'll talk about this later. So this is important. Bolsa Família has an impact on poverty reduction and inequality reduction, but not by itself. BPC, benefício de prestação continuada, which is a benefit for old people and deficient people attached to the minimum wage, was really, really important. And this now it's one of the main fights in Temer's administration. Okay, when we are talking about social assistance policy in Brazil, we are still trying to think, and this is quite similar to the Argentinian case, Rubén, and I'm really glad you are here because I've used your papers a lot. And, okay, we are still trying to recognize social assistance as a social policy. Since the 1988 Constitution, it's formally recognized, but we are still trying to organize this policy area as a public policy, moving beyond philanthropic perspective, a more charity perspective, and based on, and when we are talking about social assistance, we are not only talking about benefits, we are talking about services for vulnerable families, and this is important. We are not only talking about poor people. For sure, those dimensions are correlated, but we are talking about violence, drug addiction, age-related disabilities, street dwellers, and other types of vulnerabilities. And so we are talking about services, and we are also talking about benefits, including social pensions for poor and deficient people, BPC, and Bolsa Família. So Bolsa Família is part of a broader scheme of social assistance. And there are differences in concepts and agendas when we look at services and at benefits. Okay, we can talk about this later. And this matter in terms of the kinds of state capacities we need in order to deliver these services and benefits. Okay, what has happened since 2003, since Lula's government? We have worked a lot in terms of increasing levels of social expanding in social assistance, expansion of public units. These public units, especially CRAS, Centro de Referência da Assistência Social, are the entry door for the social assistance in Brazil. They are the entry door for Bolsa Família, and they are really widespread now in the municipalities. Okay, we have done a lot in terms of building national parameters for service delivery. Service delivery in social assistance are still really dependent on private provision, non-profit private provision, but now we have regulation. And this is quite important, this is quite new, how we can build these national parameters, and how we can expand and qualify human resource for social assistance. This is quite an improvement in terms of building state capacity for this area. Of course, we have great regional variation. I don't have data here, but we do have, okay? And this is quite important. When we are talking about this idea of national policy system, this is really important in the Brazilian Federation, okay? It's really important to understand the role the federal level has and the role the municipal level has. The state level should coordinate the municipal actions, but it's much more a federal and municipal game, okay, with some variations. But the main point here is the federal level is responsible for the general decision-making process, which means defining regulation, coordination mechanisms, and co-funding parameters, okay? And it's important to differentiate the type of federal negotiation in social assistance and the centralized pattern in the case of Bolsa Família. You know, we have different decision-making process. In the case of Bolsa Família, we have a much more isolated policy community, you know. In the case of social assistance, we have federal arenas for negotiating the parameters, and this makes a huge difference. Bolsa Família use part of the state capacity that SUAS has built, but do not enter all this federal negotiation and even corporative disputes that characterize social assistance. And this is my argument. This has some impact on the final results. And the municipal level is in charge of the implementation of Bolsa Família, reaching the families and delivering the benefits. But the main decision-making process is centralized at the federal level, okay? And at the federal level, we have some space for integrating Bolsa Família and other social policies. At the municipal level, the conditionalities in health, school attendance and healthcare checks are being carried out. So it's really interesting to see how different social policies are being or not being integrated at the municipal level. And this is another, I think I have said this, okay? The expansion of social assistance units at the municipal level, it's really important. And how these units are reaching or not the most vulnerable territories, you know, in order to deal with the capillarity issues. And this go further into local political dynamics, etc., etc. I don't have time to go on this, but my agenda has moved towards this part. How long? Ixi, tá, vou parar de falar. Okay, so when we are thinking about dimensions of state capacity in the case of SUAS, Sistema Único de Assistência Social, I think these are the main dimensions, okay? Definition of normative parameters as a innovation considering the legacy of fragmentation and discretion. We have more resource and federative co-funding through the Fundo Nacional de Assistência Social, federative decision-making process in arenas such as CIT e Conselho Nacional de Assistência. We have the expansion of public units, both at the basic level and at the more complex level. We can go back to this. We have an expansion and qualification of human resource, and now we have a really structured, monitoring and evaluation system through SAGE and Census SUAS. Okay, when we are talking about Bolsa Família, I would like to stress some highlights. We are talking about one of the largest conditional cash transfers in the world. We are talking about almost 14 million families, which means 46 million people, which is quite a lot of people. We are talking about a target benefit. This is a benefit targeted poor people, and the poverty line in this case is quite low. We are talking about extremely poor people and poor people who earns below 154 reais per capita. The average benefit is quite low, which is also important to stress. We are not talking about a lot of money, you know. This is why it's not so important. It's really important for poverty levels decrease, but not very important for inequality. Considering funding, we are talking about less than 0.5%. How can 0.5. I'm tired and getting stupid. Sorry. 0.5% of the GDP. So we are not talking about a lot of money. And people make a fuss on this. Oh, we are spending a lot of money on this. We are not. This is quite important for the discussion with Andrew. You know, how we can understand the conditionalities and how the conditionalities foster some kind of integration between CCT program and universal social policies. This is quite controversial because we are much talking about access. We are not talking about the quality of the schools and the quality of the health system, but this is quite a big issue. How we can think about targets within universalism, how we can reach the poorest in order to put them inside the universal social policies. I think this is a main issue to discuss. We are talking about a centralized decision-making process with municipal implementation. This is interesting to see, and this helps to avoid some charges on clientelism and political use at the local level. It's important to understand how it works. We have some really interesting coordination mechanisms. You know, this is quite important to understand the federative relationships, the Cadastro Único, the unified registration place, and the whole, this kind of incentive called IGD, Decentralized Management Index. We have some federal funds transferred to the municipalities once they reach a certain level of good indicators considering enrollments and conditionalities for C. We have, it's really, really important to understand how Bolsa Família reached this level of coverage and targeting through using the capacities that has been built inside the social assistance. This kind of integration is quite important. Not only considering the social assistance units, but considering the whole social workers play at the local level, integrating the poor people and the vulnerable people in the territories with other social policies. This is quite important to understand, and we have data on this. The idea of regular evaluation, and this is quite interesting to dialogue with Andrews. We have good indicators of coverage and targeting, but especially in areas such as North and Northeast that are not considering the best scenario in terms of administrative capacity. You know, this is interesting. We don't have the best indicators in the riches and more structural areas. We have better indicators in areas that are considered with less local administrative capacity. And this is quite important for our general debate. You know, it's not only a matter of capacities, it's a matter of agendas and projects. What is the relevance of Bolsa Família in the North, in the Northeast, and what is the relevance of Bolsa Família in Santa Catarina? Okay, this matters a lot. We should look at state capacities, but we also should look at politics and agendas, okay? And what kind of actors are really pushing for some agendas and what kind of actors are not that interested in that kind of agenda. And for sure it has to do with the social indicators and who has more absolute poverty indicators and relative ones, etc. And this is another point, Andrew. How Bolsa Família is being integrated with other social policies. Okay, and here I think we have to consider this line. During Lula's term, I think the agenda was totally focused on expanding coverage and improving targeting. It has to do with improving Cadastro Único, improving the main mechanisms, and improving normative acts. This is a whole discussion on Bolsa Família. We have a loose regulation. We don't have a lot of discussion in the parliament. We have a lot of decision inside the bureaucracy. We have intra-bureaucratic normatization, and this has advantages and disadvantages. You know, it's a much faster process when once we don't deal with the Congress, but once the politics change, it's a main issue. During Dilma's term, I think the agenda of integration of different social policies has moved a little bit further. You know, once we think about big plans such as Brazil without extreme poverty plan, how we can think about not only conditional cash transfers, but how poor people can get access to health, education, the labor markets, how we can think about other dimensions that are for sure necessary for social integration. We cannot think about social integration or decreasing inequality, improving poor people's lives, only thinking about conditional cash transfers, for sure. And how we can move beyond a more target perspective to a more integrative perspective. Okay, I think this was a really important agenda, how we can think about Bolsa Família in Pronatec, Bolsa Família, and several other social initiatives. And now, for sure, we have a different challenge. By now, I don't think Bolsa Família has faced a lot of changes. The benefit value has increased, but we are facing a terrible economic crisis, a fiscal crisis, a terrible fiscal adjustment plan, PEC 55. And I think we have some perspectives from that. We are going to move from welfare to workfare. There are new conditionalities being planned, There are new ideas considering the time people can be receiving Bolsa Família. And this is a really important issue. In Brazil, our labor market is quite unstable, and poor people get in and out the labor market, and we cannot, we should look at this, how these people are engaged in really informal sectors, low paid jobs, and it makes no sense to think about, we should limit, like in Mexico or the Chilean case, they should stay only for 1 year or 2 years. And this is why we should move the discussion beyond Bolsa Família, how we can think about different channels for social integration, beyond conditional cash transfers. We have moved, this may make a huge difference, from focusing on inclusion errors to exclusion ones. We are much more interested now, the government as a whole, in getting outside Bolsa Família the ones that do not feel the eligibility criteria. Once in Dilma, we were talking about how to put in Bolsa Família quilombolas, ribeirinhos, street dwellers. This is a huge change, okay? Considering social assistance policy, we have moved towards a more assistencialist perspective. This program called Happy Child, Criança Feliz. And I think we have moved a little bit further towards a more liberal vision of social protection. But it's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.